My stepson called me a gold-digging leech at his graduation party yesterday, but his father was about to show him exactly whose money paid for his entire education. When I married Robert 5 years ago, his son Tyler was 17 and finishing high school. Robert told me Tyler was protective of his dad's finances since his mother had left them in debt. I understood and tried to give Tyler space to adjust. Robert worked as a regional manager for a hardware store chain. Good, stable job, but nothing fancy. I worked in tech consulting, which Tyler assumed meant answering phones somewhere. He never asked for details and I never corrected him. The comments started immediately. Tyler would visit from college and inspect our house like he was taking inventory. Nice new couch. Dad must be doing well. Expensive-looking kitchen renovation. Hope you're not spending all Dad's savings. Robert would just change the subject. He'd asked me to be patient with Tyler. Said he'd come around eventually. Tyler got worse over time. When we went out to dinner, he'd loudly tell the waiter to give his dad the check because she doesn't contribute anything. When Robert bought me birthday presents, Tyler would calculate their value and text his dad about being careful with money. When we took a vacation to Hawaii, Tyler called it financial irresponsibility and accused me of manipulating his father into wasting money. Last month, Tyler graduated from the state university with a computer science degree. Robert wanted to throw him a big party. I handled all the planning, hired caterers, rented a venue, and invited 70 people. Tyler thanked his father for the expensive party in front of everyone. Didn't acknowledge me at all. During the toasts, Tyler's uncle mentioned how proud Robert must be, paying for college entirely so Tyler graduated debt-free. Tyler raised his glass. To my dad, who sacrificed everything despite having a mooching dependent at home. Several people gasped. Robert stood up. Tyler, apologize to your stepmother immediately. Tyler laughed. Why? Everyone knows she's a gold digger. She probably pushed for this expensive party to make you look good while she does nothing. 4 years of college, rent, food, books, and she just sat at home spending your money. Robert's face was turning red. Tyler, you need to understand something. Tyler kept going. I've watched her leech off you for 5 years. Designer clothes, fancy car, acting like she earned any of it. At least Mom worked part-time. This one just attached herself to your wallet. That's when Robert pulled out his phone. He opened his banking app. Tyler, this is my salary. $58,000 a year. Decent money, but let's look at the expenses for your college. He started scrolling. Tuition, $30,000 per year. Rent, $12,000. Meal plan, $5,000. Books and supplies, $3,000. That's $50,000 a year just for your education. Tyler shifted uncomfortably. So, this is our household income. $420,000 last year. The room went completely silent. Tyler's mouth fell open. What? Your stepmother is the senior director of cloud architecture at her firm. She makes 7 times what I make. She paid for your entire education. Every single penny. Robert kept going. This house we live in, she bought it before we got married. The renovation, her year-end bonus, the Hawaii vacation, she surprised me for our anniversary. My car, she bought it when mine broke down. Tyler was stammering. But she never said anything. I finally spoke. You never asked. You assumed I was nothing and treated me like trash for 5 years. Robert pulled up more records. The graduation party you're enjoying? She paid for everything. The laptop you're using for your new job? She bought it. The suit you're wearing? She took you shopping last month and you thanked me for it when she paid. Tyler's girlfriend whispered something and started gathering her things to leave. Robert wasn't finished. You know what I contribute? I buy groceries and pay for my own golf membership. Your stepmother covers literally everything else. She even set up a trust fund for you that you were going to receive at 25. Was going to. Tyler went pale. Was? Robert didn't hesitate. He pulled up another screen on his phone and turned it toward Tyler. The trust fund account showed a balance of $250,000. Tyler's eyes went wide as he stared at the numbers. Robert swiped to another document. The terms were right there in legal language. Full access at age 25. But there was a clause about behavioral conditions and family respect. Tyler reached for the phone, but Robert pulled it back. The room stayed dead silent. I could hear someone's heel clicking on the floor as they shifted their weight. Tyler's girlfriend picked up her purse and walked straight to the exit without looking back at him. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, just pushed through the door and was gone. Tyler watched her leave and his face went from pale to gray. His uncle stepped forward and crossed his arms. The question came out sharp and direct. How could Tyler live in my house for 5 whole years and never once ask what I actually do for work? Tyler opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His uncle shook his head and walked away to get his coat. Other guests started moving. They grabbed their jackets from chairs. Someone picked up their gift bag from the table. A woman I recognized from Robert's office touched my arm as she passed and whispered that she was sorry. Another guest stopped to shake Robert's hand and congratulated Tyler in this weird, tight voice before rushing out. Within 10 minutes, half the party had cleared out. People were making up excuses about early mornings and long drives. Tyler stood there in the middle of the room watching everyone leave. His hands hung at his sides. He kept looking at the door his girlfriend had gone through. Then he'd look at me. Then at his father. Then back at the door. I stayed in my chair. The caterers started quietly packing up food in the corner. The venue felt huge and empty, even with 30 people still there. I watched Tyler's world fall apart around him and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger. Just this weird blank feeling like I was watching it happen to someone else. Robert's brother came over and pulled up a chair next to me. He spoke quietly so no one else could hear. Said he was sorry for not realizing what Tyler had been saying all these years. He'd heard some comments but thought it was just step-family adjustment stuff. Didn't know it had been going on constantly. He squeezed my shoulder and went to find his wife. 20 minutes later, the venue was almost empty. The last few guests were doing that awkward thing where they congratulate Tyler but can't quite look him in the eye. An older couple I didn't know well stopped by our table. Told Tyler they were proud of his degree. Told Robert it was a nice party. Looked at me like they wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. Then they left too. Tyler walked over to the gift table. All the presents were still sitting there in their nice wrapping paper. The laptop box I'd bought him sat on top. He stared at it for a long time. Picked it up. Put it down. Picked it up again. His hands were shaking. The caterers finished packing and asked Robert where to send the final invoice. Robert started to answer, but I cut in and gave them my business card. They nodded and left. The venue manager came out and asked if we needed more time. Robert said no. We'd be out in 15 minutes. Tyler tried to walk toward me. I held up my hand. Didn't say anything. Just held it up like a stop sign. He froze. I stood up and walked past him to the exit. Grabbed my coat. Headed for the car. Robert caught up with me in the parking lot. Asked if I wanted him to drive. I said no. Got in my car. He got in the passenger seat. Tyler came out carrying some of the gifts. Loaded them into Robert's car. We all drove home separately, even though we'd come together. At the house, I went straight to our bedroom. Closed the door. Sat on the edge of the bed. Robert came in a few minutes later. He closed the door behind him and just stood there. Then he sat down next to me on the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. He put his head in his hands. Said he should have shut down Tyler's comments years ago. Should have made him apologize the first time. Should have protected me instead of asking me to be patient. I looked at him. Told him that patience became enabling. His son spent 5 years publicly attacking me while I paid for his entire life. Robert looked crushed, but I was too angry to care right then. Too tired. 5 years of biting my tongue and it all came up at once. I stood up. Told Robert I needed space. Walked down the hall to the guest room. Closed that door too. Through the wall, I could hear Tyler and Robert in the kitchen. Their voices were raised. Couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Tyler sounded desperate. Robert sounded angry. It went on past midnight. My phone kept buzzing. Text after text. Some from people at the party saying they were sorry for not speaking up. Others asking if I was okay. One from Robert's coworker saying she always knew I was impressive. I turned the phone face down and tried to sleep. Didn't work. Just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the argument in the kitchen finally die down around 1 in the morning. The next morning I left for work before 6. Didn't want to see either of them. Didn't want to talk. Just needed to be somewhere normal. Somewhere people knew what I did and respected it. My office building felt like safety. Swiped my badge. Took the elevator to the 14th floor. Made coffee in the break room. Georgia came in around 7:30. Took one look at my face and asked what happened. I told her everything. The party, the toast, Tyler's comments, Robert's revelation, the trust fund, all of it. Georgia's face went from concerned to furious in about 30 seconds. She asked why I tolerated it for so long. That was the question I'd been asking myself all night. Couldn't come up with a good answer. Georgia sat down across from me, started pointing things out, said I'd been hiding my own success to make Robert's son comfortable, shrinking myself to fit his narrative. She was right. I'd stopped mentioning promotions at home, played down my work. Let Tyler's story go unchallenged because Robert asked me to be patient. Georgia asked if I realized I'd been part of my own problem. That hit hard. I had been. I'd let it happen. Made myself smaller and smaller while Tyler got louder and meaner. I worked through the whole day barely seeing my computer screen. Left at 5, drove home, walked in the front door. Tyler was sitting in the living room. He looked terrible. Eyes red and puffy. Hadn't shaved. Same clothes from yesterday. He stood up when he saw me, started with the apology. I cut him off, told him I didn't want to hear sorry right now. Robert appeared from the kitchen, suggested we all needed time before having this conversation. Tyler ignored him, started talking fast, said his mother always told him Robert's money problems were because he was too generous, too soft, let people take advantage. So Tyler thought he was protecting his dad. I stared at him, pointed out that he was 22 years old, just spent 4 years in college where they supposedly teach critical thinking. His excuse about protecting Robert fell apart when I asked why protection required calling me names at every opportunity, why it meant calculating the cost of my birthday presents, why it meant treating me like garbage in restaurants. Tyler's mouth opened and closed. No answer came out. I walked away from Tyler standing there with nothing to say and spent the next 3 days avoiding both him and Robert. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Tyler that I deleted without reading. Robert tried to talk to me twice, but I told him I needed space to think. On the 4th day, Robert's phone rang during breakfast, and I could tell from his face something was wrong. He answered and listened for a long time without saying much. When he hung up, he looked at me and said that was Bernard, Tyler's roommate from college. Bernard wanted Robert to know he was disappointed in how Tyler treated me. Apparently, Tyler had complained about me constantly at the school, calling me a gold digger to anyone who would listen. Bernard said he always thought it was weird that Tyler was so angry about his dad's wife, but never actually asked questions about what I did for work. Robert looked sick hearing this, realizing Tyler had been spreading his version of our family to his friends for years. I felt something twist in my stomach, knowing Tyler's contempt wasn't just private comments at home, but a whole narrative he'd built with his college friends. The next morning, Robert showed me an email Tyler's new job had sent him about their social media policy and professional conduct expectations. Tyler had forwarded it to Robert in a panic, asking if someone from the party worked at his company. Robert explained the email was just standard new hire stuff that every employee gets, but Tyler was convinced his public meltdown had already damaged his reputation. I read through the generic policy language about representing the company professionally and maintaining appropriate online presence. Tyler's paranoia was obvious in his frantic text messages to Robert, asking if he should call HR to explain the situation. Part of me felt satisfied watching Tyler spiral, imagining him at his new desk wondering if his coworkers had heard what he said about me. But another part felt uncomfortable with how much I was enjoying his suffering. I caught myself checking his ex-girlfriend's social media to see if she'd posted anything else, which made me realize I was becoming obsessed with watching his life fall apart. I needed to focus on something I could control, so I threw myself into work. My team was leading a cloud migration for a Fortune 500 client, moving their entire infrastructure to a new platform. The project required 14-hour days and constant problem-solving, which was exactly what I needed. I stopped leaving work at 5 and started staying until 8 or 9, losing myself in technical challenges that had clear solutions. Christian, my boss, noticed after about a week. He stopped by my desk one evening when most people had gone home and asked if everything was okay. I gave him the short version about my stepson's graduation party and the confrontation. Christian listened without interrupting, then told me to take whatever time I needed, but I explained that working actually helped. Being at the office made me feel competent and valued in a way I hadn't felt at home in years. Christian nodded and said my door was always open if I needed to talk, then left me to my migration planning. The next day, Robert suggested we have family dinner with Tyler. I was at my computer working on capacity planning when he brought it up. I turned around and told him I wasn't ready to sit at a table with Tyler until I'd processed my own anger. Robert looked hurt, but I kept going, explaining that his son didn't get access to me just because he was scared of consequences now. Robert stood there in the doorway of my home office looking lost. He asked what I needed from him right now. I took a breath and told him I needed him to stop protecting Tyler from discomfort and start protecting me from further disrespect. That meant Tyler didn't get to treat our home as a safe haven until he'd done actual work to change. Robert agreed, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to support me, but every instinct he had was telling him to smooth things over with his son. I started noticing this pattern everywhere in our relationship. The way Robert would change the subject when Tyler made comments about money. The way he'd ask me to be patient instead of telling Tyler to stop. The way he'd positioned himself as the peacemaker instead of my partner. Seeing it clearly for the first time made me angry all over again. That night, I got an email from Tyler. The subject line was, "I need to explain." And when I opened it, there was a 10-page document attached. I skimmed through it and realized he'd written out every assumption he made about me and why he was wrong. He detailed how he thought I was a gold digger, how he calculated the cost of things Robert bought me, how he convinced himself I was manipulating his father. The whole thing read like a college essay, technically correct but completely hollow. There was no real emotion in it, Just a list of mistakes and corrections like he was turning in homework. I closed the email without responding because words were easy, and I'd heard 5 years of his cruel words already. The next day at work, Georgia came by my desk with coffee and asked how I was handling everything. I showed her Tyler's email on my phone, and she read through it while shaking her head. She told me I was right to wait for actions, not apologies. Tyler could write essays all day, but that didn't mean anything without changed behavior. Georgia suggested I focus on what I needed rather than what Tyler wanted to give, which hit me hard because I hadn't really thought about it that way. 2 weeks after the party, I met Alyssa for lunch at a place downtown. Alyssa was Bernard's sister, and she worked in HR at a tech company, so I figured she might have perspective on the trust fund situation. We ordered sandwiches, and I explained everything that had happened. Alyssa listened carefully, asking questions about Tyler's behavior over the years and how Robert had responded. Then she asked what I wanted the outcome to be: punishment, reconciliation, or protection. I sat there with my sandwich halfway to my mouth and realized I didn't actually know. I wanted to not feel bad in my own home anymore, but beyond that, I hadn't figured out what I actually wanted from Tyler or Robert. Alyssa watched me think through this and then said something that changed how I was looking at the whole situation. She pointed out that the trust fund shouldn't be about revenge, but about whether Tyler had shown the maturity to handle significant money responsibly. Someone who spent 5 years making cruel assumptions about a step-parent's worth might make equally poor judgments about other people. Her professional perspective made me see this as a question of Tyler's character, not just punishment for hurting me. That night, Robert mentioned that Tyler had been researching my actual career. Apparently, he'd been reading articles I'd published about cloud architecture and watching conference talks I'd given at industry events. Robert seemed to think this was progress, like Tyler finally taking an interest meant something. I pointed out that Tyler could have done this research at any point in 5 years. The fact that he only became curious after public shame didn't impress me at all. Robert looked disappointed but didn't argue. A few days later, Robert came to me with another request from Tyler. Tyler wanted to ask if he could take me to lunch to talk, but he was using Robert as the messenger like we were countries negotiating through a third party. I told Robert that Tyler was 22 years old with my phone number, and if he wanted to talk to me, he could ask me directly. Robert looked uncomfortable being caught in the middle, which was exactly where he'd put himself by never establishing boundaries with Tyler. I went back to my work project, and Robert walked away without saying anything else. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing architecture diagrams at my desk. Tyler's name appeared on the screen with a message asking if we could talk sometime. I stared at the text for a full minute before responding that we could meet at the coffee shop near my office in 3 days. He replied immediately with a simple thank you, which felt different from his usual entitled tone. I forwarded the message to Georgia, and she came by my desk within 5 minutes. She suggested we practice different scenarios, so I wouldn't get blindsided by whatever Tyler planned to say. We spent my lunch break in an empty conference room with Georgia playing Tyler, throwing out possible excuses and manipulations while I practiced staying calm and direct. She made me rehearse responses to emotional appeals, defensive justifications, and half apologies until I felt ready to handle whatever he brought to the conversation. On the day of the meeting, I arrived at the coffee shop exactly on time and found Tyler already sitting at a corner table with 2 drinks in front of him. He stood up when he saw me and gestured to one of the cups. He said he'd asked Robert what I usually ordered, which was true because Tyler had never paid attention to my preferences in 5 years. I sat down and picked up the cup, letting the silence stretch between us while I waited for him to start talking. Tyler began by saying he'd spent 5 years being cruel, based on assumptions he never bothered to question. His voice was quiet, and he kept his eyes on the table instead of looking at me. I sipped my coffee and watched him carefully, looking for signs that he actually understood what he'd done, versus just performing remorse because he got caught. He talked about specific things he'd said to me over the years and acknowledged how each comment was designed to make me feel small and unwelcome in my own home. Tyler's hands were shaking slightly as he explained that his mother had told him repeatedly that Robert's financial problems after the divorce were because he was too soft with money and let people take advantage of him. He said she'd painted Robert as a victim who needed protection, so Tyler appointed himself as his father's financial guardian. I set down my coffee and pointed out that his mother's bitterness about her own situation didn't excuse him treating me like a villain for 5 years without ever speaking to me like a human being. Tyler's face changed when I said that, his expression shifting from rehearsed apology to something that looked like genuine shame. He sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, seeming to see his behavior from outside himself for the first time. His shoulders slumped and he nodded slowly, acknowledging that he'd been cruel by choice, not because he was protecting anyone. I asked Tyler what he actually knew about me now, after doing his research, and he surprised me by pulling out his phone and showing me notes he'd taken. He talked about specific projects I'd led, including the healthcare system migration that had been featured in industry publications. He mentioned innovations I'd contributed to cloud security protocols and how my work had influenced practices at other companies. Then he admitted that he'd assumed tech consulting meant low-level support work because he never imagined a woman in Robert's life could be a senior executive. He said the assumption was sexist, and he'd never questioned it because it fit the narrative he wanted to believe. His honest acknowledgement of his own prejudices meant more than his earlier apologies, because it showed he understood the deeper problem wasn't just rudeness, but the sexist assumptions driving his behavior. Tyler asked what he could do to make this right, and I told him the truth, that I didn't know if he could, and I wasn't sure I wanted to invest energy in helping him figure it out. His face fell and he looked devastated, but he nodded and said he understood he wasn't entitled to my forgiveness or guidance. I finished my coffee and stood up, feeling slightly less angry than I had been, but no more certain about whether our relationship could be repaired. Tyler stood too and thanked me for meeting him, then watched me walk out without trying to stop me or ask for another chance. The conversation had been better than I expected, but words were still just words after 5 years of cruelty. When I got home that evening, Robert was waiting in the living room and immediately asked how the meeting went. I told him it was fine, but I was still processing everything, which clearly frustrated him because he wanted resolution and reassurance that his family would be okay. He started asking specific questions about what Tyler said, and whether I thought he was sincere. I stopped him and pointed out that he'd prioritized his own comfort over my dignity for 5 years by asking me to be patient with Tyler's abuse instead of shutting it down. Robert's face crumpled and he started crying, admitting that he'd been scared of losing his son after the divorce and didn't want to create more conflict. He said he knew it was wrong, but he'd been terrified that standing up to Tyler would drive Tyler away completely. I sat down next to Robert and told him that his fear of conflict meant I absorbed all the hostility while he maintained peaceful relationships with both of us, which wasn't fair or sustainable. He cried harder and apologized, acknowledging that he'd failed me by choosing the path of least resistance instead of protecting me from his son's cruelty. This conversation felt different from our previous talks because Robert was finally confronting his own role in enabling Tyler's behavior, instead of just sympathizing with my hurt. He admitted he'd been a coward who sacrificed my well-being to avoid uncomfortable confrontations with Tyler. We sat together for a long time while Robert processed what he'd done, and I processed whether his understanding came too late to save our marriage. The next morning, Robert's brother called while we were having breakfast. Robert put the call on speaker, and his brother said his own kids had been asking questions about respect and assumptions after witnessing the party confrontation. Apparently, Tyler's public humiliation had become a teaching moment in their family about not judging people without knowing their actual circumstances. Robert's brother then admitted something that surprised me, saying he'd always assumed I was nice but decorative, never realizing I was the primary breadwinner or that I had a serious career. He apologized for his own assumptions and said watching Tyler get confronted had made him examine his own biases. The conversation was awkward, but I appreciated his honesty about how he'd seen me all these years. 3 weeks later, I flew to Seattle for a major industry conference where I was speaking on a panel about women in tech leadership. Sitting on that stage with 4 other senior women in the field reminded me of my identity outside this family drama. We discussed challenges, strategies, and the importance of visibility in male-dominated spaces. After the panel, several attendees came up to talk to me, and multiple people mentioned reading my published work on cloud architecture. One woman in her 30s thanked me specifically for being visible in the field, because it helped her believe she could reach senior leadership too. The experience reminded me how much I'd been defining myself by Tyler's contempt, instead of my actual accomplishments. I'd let his narrow view of me shrink my sense of my own worth and achievements. When I returned from Seattle 2 days later, I found a card on the kitchen counter with my name written on the envelope in handwriting I didn't recognize at first. Inside was a note from Tyler thanking me specifically for funding his education and acknowledging that he'd never once expressed gratitude to me directly in 5 years. The note was longer than I expected, detailing the costs I'd covered and what those expenses had meant for his ability to graduate debt-free. Attached to the card was a check for $5,000 with a message saying he knew it was a tiny fraction of what I'd spent, but he wanted to start paying me back from his new job salary. The gesture surprised me because it cost him something real and tangible, rather than just being empty words. I set the card on the counter and stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what I felt about Tyler's attempt to make material amends for years of emotional cruelty. I didn't respond to the check or card for 2 days, letting them sit on the counter while I figured out what they meant to me. Robert noticed but didn't push. which I appreciated because I needed space to sort through my own feelings without his input. On the third day, I deposited the check and texted Tyler a simple thank you, nothing more. The gesture had been real and cost him something, but I wasn't ready to pretend $5,000 erased 5 years of cruelty. Robert came home from work that evening and found me staring at my laptop in the kitchen. Not really working, but not really doing anything else either. He sat down across from me and started talking about Tyler, telling me his son had been asking questions about us lately. Tyler wanted to know how we met, what our first date was like, why I agreed to marry Robert when I made so much more money than him. Robert's voice got quiet when he told me what he'd said to Tyler, that I loved him and money had never been the basis of our relationship. I felt something shift in my chest hearing Robert defend what we had to his son, but the feeling came with anger attached to it. I closed my laptop and looked at Robert directly, asking him why it took 5 years and a public explosion for him to say these things to Tyler. Robert's face fell and he admitted he didn't have a good answer, just that he'd been hoping Tyler would figure it out on his own eventually. The excuse felt weak and we both knew it, but at least Robert wasn't trying to justify his failure anymore. He reached across the table for my hand and I let him take it, not pulling away but not squeezing back either. 3 days later, I met Georgia and her wife at their favorite restaurant downtown, grateful for an evening away from the heaviness that had settled over my house. We ordered wine and appetizers, falling into easy conversation about work projects and weekend plans before Georgia's wife asked the question I'd been avoiding. She wanted to know if I was thinking about leaving Robert over everything that had happened with Tyler. The question hit me sideways because I hadn't let myself frame it that clearly. But sitting there with my wine glass halfway to my mouth, I realized that's exactly what I'd been doing. I'd been running calculations in my head for weeks, weighing whether Robert's love justified 5 years of watching his son treat me like garbage while Robert asked me to be patient. Georgia watched my face and said gently that I seemed to be waiting for Robert to prove something, and I needed to figure out what that proof actually looked like. Her wife added that no amount of apologizing would matter if I'd already decided the relationship was broken beyond repair, which made me set down my wine glass with shaking hands. I told them I didn't know if I'd made that decision yet, but I was tired of feeling like a guest in my own marriage, always accommodating Robert's son and Robert's guilt and Robert's need for family peace. Georgia reached across the table and squeezed my hand, telling me that whatever I decided, she'd support me completely. We finished dinner talking about lighter things, but the question stayed with me through the drive home, sitting in my passenger seat like an uninvited companion. I found Robert in the living room watching television when I got back, and instead of going upstairs like I'd planned, I sat down next to him and turned off the TV. Robert looked startled but didn't protest, just waited for me to speak while his hands twisted together in his lap. I told him I'd been questioning our marriage because his failure to protect me from Tyler had made me feel like a second-class member of my own household, and I wasn't sure I could get past that feeling. Robert's face went pale and his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't interrupt or try to explain away what I was saying. He asked what he could do now to show me I was his priority, his voice breaking on the last word. I told him I needed to see steady action over time, not big gestures or dramatic promises, just him maintaining boundaries with Tyler even when it was hard and uncomfortable. Robert nodded and wiped his eyes, asking if I still loved him despite everything that had happened. I looked at my husband sitting there crying and told him honestly that I didn't know, which made him cry harder, but he accepted it without argument. We sat together in silence for a long time after that, both of us processing what our marriage had become and whether we could build something better from the wreckage. My phone buzzed the next morning while I was getting ready for work, a text from Tyler with a photo attached. The picture showed him standing in an office lobby wearing the suit I'd bought him, looking nervous and professional in equal measure. His message thanked me specifically for the professional clothes that had helped him make a good first impression on his first day at his new job. I stared at the photo for several minutes, surprised by how much the specific acknowledgement affected me. Tyler hadn't lumped this under things Dad provided or made vague statements about family support. He'd recognized my exact contribution and thanked me for it directly. I saved the photo but didn't respond right away, needing time to figure out whether this was genuine change or just Tyler being strategic about getting his trust fund back. Robert came into the bedroom while I was still holding my phone and asked if everything was okay. I showed him Tyler's message and Robert smiled, saying his son was really trying to understand what he'd done wrong. I told Robert that trying wasn't the same as succeeding, and Tyler had a long way to go before I'd trust his motivations. Robert's smile faded, but he nodded, accepting my caution without trying to talk me out of it. That evening, Robert suggested we try couples therapy to work through the trust issues that had developed between us, and I agreed immediately because I wanted our marriage to survive, but had no idea how to fix what felt broken. We found a therapist who had an opening the following week and spent the drive to our first appointment in tense silence, both of us nervous about what we might discover. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who asked us to each identify what we needed from the other person moving forward. Robert said he needed to know I still loved him despite his failures, his voice shaking as he spoke. I said I needed to know he'd choose me even when it cost him something with Tyler, that I needed to see him prioritize my well-being over his son's comfort. The therapist wrote notes and asked follow-up questions, digging into the patterns we'd established over 5 years and why those patterns had felt acceptable at the time. Robert admitted he'd been terrified of losing Tyler after the divorce and had sacrificed my comfort to keep his son close. I admitted I'd let it happen because I'd been trying to prove I was worth keeping around, which sounded pathetic when I said it out loud. The therapist pointed out that we'd both been operating from fear rather than trust, and we needed to rebuild our foundation before we could address the damage Tyler had caused. We left that first session exhausted and raw, but Robert reached for my hand in the parking lot and I didn't pull away. Our second therapy session the following week went deeper into my own behavior patterns, and I found myself admitting things I'd barely acknowledged to myself. I told the therapist I'd been financially supporting our household as a way to prove my worth, basically trying to earn Tyler's respect through money since he clearly valued financial contribution above everything else. The therapist looked at me with kind eyes and said I'd been operating from Tyler's value system instead of my own, letting his contempt define my role in the family. The observation hit me like a physical blow because she was completely right. I'd spent 5 years trying to prove something to a kid who'd decided I was worthless before we even met, and in doing so, I'd made his opinion matter more than my own sense of self. Robert squeezed my hand and said he'd never wanted me to feel like I had to earn my place in our family, which made me laugh bitterly because his actions had communicated exactly that message. The therapist asked what I would have done differently if I hadn't been trying to prove anything to Tyler, and I realized I had no idea who I would have been in this marriage without that pressure. We ended the session with homework assignments about identifying our core values separate from each other's expectations, which felt both terrifying and necessary. Tyler texted me a few days later, asking if he could come by the house to pick up some items he'd left in his old room, and I told him yes, but made clear I'd be home when he came. He arrived on Saturday morning looking nervous, knocking on the door of the house I owned like he was a stranger asking permission to enter. I let him in and watched as he carefully asked if he could go upstairs, thanking me for letting him visit. The overly polite behavior felt fake at first, like he was performing respect rather than feeling it, but I reminded myself that practiced behavior sometimes becomes real over time. Tyler went upstairs and I followed, not willing to let him roam through my house unsupervised after years of him treating it like his father's property. He packed his things quietly, asking before he opened drawers or moved items, showing a level of consideration he'd never demonstrated before. I sat on the edge of his old bed watching him work, trying to figure out if this carefulness came from genuine respect or just fear of losing his trust fund. Tyler glanced at me a few times but didn't try to make conversation, just focused on gathering his belongings and putting them in boxes. Tyler found an old photo album under some textbooks and paused, looking at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked if he could look through it and I said yes, curious about what memories he was chasing. Tyler sat down on the floor and opened the album, and I moved to sit next to him as he started pointing out pictures of his mother. He talked about how angry she'd been after the divorce, how that anger had colored everything about his childhood and shaped how he viewed his father's relationships. Tyler admitted he'd been prepared to hate me before we even met, primed by his mother's bitterness to see any woman in Robert's life as a threat. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk through the foundation of his hostility, even though none of it excused his behavior. Tyler showed me a picture of his mother at his 8th birthday party, her smile tight and forced, and said she'd spent the whole event complaining about Robert's irresponsibility with money. He'd internalized that narrative and carried it with him into our family, never questioning whether his mother's version of events was accurate or fair. Tyler turned more pages and stopped at a photo of himself at his high school graduation, cap and gown, and forced smile. He told me his mother had spent that entire ceremony sitting next to him complaining about how Robert's new girlfriend was ruining their family, poisoning what should have been a celebration with her ongoing bitterness. Tyler said he'd arrived at college already hating me based entirely on his mother's stories, and he'd never once questioned whether that hatred was justified. I looked at the photo of 17-year-old Tyler and pointed out that he'd had 4 years of higher education to develop critical thinking skills, but he'd chosen to maintain his prejudice instead of examining it. Tyler flinched at my words but didn't argue, just closed the photo album and set it aside. He said he knew he couldn't blame his mother for his own choices, that he'd been an adult for years and should have known better. The acknowledgement felt more honest than his earlier apologies, less about making me feel better and more about him confronting his own failures. Tyler finished packing his boxes and carried them downstairs, and I followed him to the front door expecting him to leave. Instead, he set down the boxes and turned to face me, his hands shoved in his pockets and his eyes on the floor. He asked if there was any chance the trust fund might be put back in place, and I appreciated that he was being direct, rather than trying to manipulate Robert into asking for him. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that it depended on whether he showed real change over months, rather than just weeks of good behavior. Tyler nodded and said he understood, accepting my answer without trying to negotiate or make promises. He thanked me for even considering it and picked up his boxes, heading out to his car without asking for help. I watched him load everything into his trunk and drive away, then went back inside and sat on the couch trying to figure out what I felt about Tyler's visit. The maturity he'd shown was more than I'd seen from him in 5 years, but I couldn't tell yet if it was genuine growth or just him being smart enough to play a longer game. The next week, Robert and I sat in our therapist's office, and she asked Robert directly what was holding him back from maintaining stronger boundaries with Tyler. Robert stared at his hands for a long time before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. He said he'd been scared that choosing me over Tyler would make him a bad father, that protecting me from Tyler's behavior felt like abandoning his son when Tyler needed him most. The therapist leaned forward and asked Robert to consider whether protecting me from abuse and holding Tyler accountable might actually make him a better father by teaching Tyler about respect and real consequences. Robert started crying, actually crying in a way I'd never seen before, and said he'd spent 5 years trying to keep everyone comfortable instead of doing what was right. He looked at me with tears running down his face and promised he'd maintain boundaries even when Tyler pushed back, that he wouldn't let his fear of being a bad father turn him into a bad husband. I reached over and took his hand, because this was the breakthrough we'd needed for months. The therapist spent the rest of the session helping Robert develop specific strategies for maintaining those boundaries, and I felt something shift in our relationship, like we were finally on the same team instead of Robert trying to balance between two sides. 2 weeks later, Christian Meyer called me into his office at work, and I thought it was about the cloud migration project I'd been leading. Instead, he closed the door and told me the executive team had been reviewing performance across all departments, and they wanted to promote me to VP of Cloud Architecture. I just sat there for a second processing what he'd said because VP was a huge jump from senior director. Christian explained that I'd earned it through my technical leadership on major projects and my strategic vision for the company's cloud infrastructure going forward. The promotion came with a significant raise and way more visibility in the industry, speaking at conferences and representing the company at high-level meetings. I thanked him and tried to sound professional, but inside I was celebrating because this was recognition I'd worked toward for years. Christian shook my hand and said the announcement would go out to the company next week, then asked if I wanted to grab coffee to discuss my new responsibilities. We spent an hour talking about the expanded role and what it would mean for my team, and I drove home feeling proud of what I'd accomplished through my own work and expertise. When I told Robert about the promotion that evening, he was genuinely proud and suggested we go out to celebrate with a nice dinner. He hugged me and said I deserved the recognition after all the late nights and complex projects I'd managed. We talked about what the new role would involve, and he listened attentively, asking good questions about my expanded responsibilities. But as the evening went on, I noticed he hadn't mentioned telling Tyler about my promotion, and that absence felt significant. I let it sit for a while, not wanting to immediately assume the worst, but the silence around Tyler started to bother me more as the night continued. We went to bed without Robert bringing up Tyler at all, and I lay there thinking about patterns and how easy it would be to slip back into hiding my success to keep Tyler comfortable. The next morning over coffee, I asked Robert directly if he was going to tell Tyler about my new role. He looked uncomfortable and admitted he wasn't sure if I'd want Tyler to know, like he was trying to protect me from potential conflict. I put down my coffee cup and told him that hiding my success to protect Tyler's feelings was exactly the pattern we needed to break in therapy. I explained that Tyler needed to see me as I actually am, a successful executive with real accomplishments, not as some smaller version that made him comfortable with his own assumptions. Robert nodded slowly and said I was right, that he'd been falling back into old habits of trying to manage everyone's comfort. He pulled out his phone right then, didn't wait or make excuses, and called Tyler. I listened as Robert told his son about my promotion to VP, explaining the significance of the role and how proud he was of my career. Tyler's response was muted, just congratulations to his dad, and Robert corrected him by saying Tyler should congratulate me directly. The call was brief, but it mattered that Robert had made it immediately instead of putting it off or avoiding it completely. 3 days later, a card arrived in the mail addressed to me from Tyler. Inside was a handwritten note expressing genuine admiration for my career accomplishments, Not the generic congratulations you'd write to anyone, but specific comments about my technical leadership and strategic work. He'd included a printout of an article about my work that he must have found online, with sections highlighted in yellow where I discussed mentoring younger professionals in tech. The gesture surprised me because it showed actual effort and attention to who I really was, rather than who he'd assumed I was for 5 years. I read through the highlighted sections and saw myself through Tyler's eyes for maybe the first time, seeing what he was learning about my actual expertise and influence in my field. The card sat on the kitchen counter for days, and I kept looking at it, trying to figure out if this was genuine interest or just Tyler being smart about repairing the relationship. Robert noticed me reading it multiple times and pointed out that Tyler had never shown interest in anyone's work before, not even his own mother's part-time job or Robert's management role. 2 months after the party confrontation, Tyler sent me a text asking if he could take Robert and me to dinner to celebrate my promotion, offering to pay for the meal himself. The gesture showed initiative because he'd reached out directly instead of going through Robert, and he was offering to contribute financially, instead of assuming we'd cover everything. I agreed to dinner because it demonstrated consideration, even though I was still cautious about his real motivations. We met at a nice Italian place downtown, and Tyler was already there when we arrived, wearing a button-down shirt and looking nervous. He stood up when we approached the table and pulled out my chair before sitting back down, small courtesies I'd never seen from him before. During dinner, Tyler asked me thoughtful questions about my new role as VP, wanting to know about the challenges of leading a large technical team and how I'd built my career in a male-dominated field. He listened attentively when I answered, following up with more questions that showed he was actually processing what I said, instead of just waiting to talk. Robert watched our interaction with visible relief, probably grateful that his son was finally treating me like a person whose work mattered. Tyler told stories about his own new job and the learning curve he was experiencing, framing himself as someone still figuring things out, rather than pretending to know everything. Halfway through dinner, Tyler mentioned that his coworkers had been discussing imposter syndrome at lunch that week, the feeling that you don't really deserve your position, and someone will figure out you're a fraud. He admitted he'd been experiencing it constantly at his new job, worried that he wasn't actually good enough, and had only been hired because his degree looked good on paper. Then he paused and made a connection I wasn't expecting. Tyler said he realized he'd been projecting that same assumption onto me, deciding I didn't deserve my success because he couldn't imagine earning it himself. The self-awareness in his observation surprised me, because it wasn't just another apology, but actual insight into his own psychology. He explained that assuming I was a gold digger had been easier than confronting his own insecurities about worth and achievement, that tearing me down had made him feel more secure in his own position. I sat there processing this connection between his imposter syndrome and his treatment of me, recognizing that it felt like genuine understanding, rather than something practiced or calculated. Robert reached under the table and squeezed my hand, probably thinking the same thing I was about whether Tyler had finally done real internal work. After dinner, Tyler asked if he could start visiting for family dinners once a week, acknowledging that he needed to rebuild our relationship through consistent presence rather than isolated gestures. I appreciated that he was framing it as his responsibility to show up regularly, instead of expecting us to welcome him back immediately. I told him we could try weekly dinners with the clear understanding that any disrespectful behavior would end the arrangement immediately. No second chances or working through it in the moment. Tyler accepted these terms without trying to negotiate or push back, just nodded and said he understood he was earning back trust, rather than demanding it as his right. We set up Thursday evenings as the regular time, and Tyler promised to let us know in advance if he couldn't make it, treating the commitment like something important rather than casual family obligation. Robert looked happier than I'd seen him in months, probably relieved that his son and wife might actually build a real relationship, instead of the hostile standoff we'd maintained for years. The first few Thursday dinners were awkward, with Tyler clearly monitoring his own behavior and asking permission before assuming anything. He'd ask if he could help in the kitchen, or whether it was okay to grab a drink from the fridge, treating our home like a space where he needed to respect boundaries, instead of somewhere he automatically belonged. Tyler started bringing groceries when he came over, showing up with ingredients to cook meals for us instead of expecting to be fed. Robert mentioned privately that Tyler had never cooked for anyone before, that even at college he'd lived on takeout and dining hall food, rather than learning to prepare actual meals. I watched Tyler in our kitchen, following recipe instructions on his phone and asking questions about cooking techniques, putting an effort to contribute something tangible. During these dinners, Tyler asked me about my day at work and actually listened to the answers, showing genuine interest in the projects I was managing and the challenges of leading a large technical team. He'd follow up on things I'd mentioned the previous week, demonstrating that he was paying attention and retaining information about my life and work. 3 months after the confrontation, Bernard called Robert and mentioned something Tyler had asked him to share. Bernard said Tyler had been in therapy for the past 2 months, working specifically on his assumptions about women and money, unpacking the beliefs his mother had taught him and examining his own biases. Tyler had asked Bernard to tell us about the therapy because he didn't want to use it as a manipulation tactic by announcing it himself, but he wanted us to know he was doing internal work beyond just changing his behavior around us. The indirect communication through Bernard felt more genuine than if Tyler had told us directly about therapy, like he understood that real change required humility rather than credit-seeking. Robert told me about the conversation that evening, and I could see he was hopeful about Tyler's progress, wanting to believe his son was finally growing up and taking responsibility. I was more cautious, but I had to admit that 3 months of consistent, respectful behavior plus therapy showed more commitment than I'd expected from someone who'd spent 5 years being cruel. The next week, I met with Alyssa at a coffee shop to discuss the trust fund situation and get her professional perspective on next steps. She brought a legal pad and asked me specific questions about what I wanted the outcome to be, whether this was about punishment for past behavior or creating accountability for future growth. I admitted I wasn't sure anymore because Tyler's changes seemed genuine, but 5 years of hurt didn't disappear in 3 months. Alyssa suggested that the trust fund shouldn't be about revenge, but about whether Tyler had demonstrated the maturity to handle significant money responsibly, pointing out that someone who'd made cruel assumptions about a step-parent's worth might make equally poor judgments about other people and situations. She helped me draft conditions for potential reinstatement that focused on demonstrated values rather than just punishing Tyler for being a jerk. The conditions included sustained respectful behavior toward me for 6 months total, continued therapy with proof of attendance, and a written reflection on what he'd learned about assumptions and respect. Alyssa pointed out that these conditions created real accountability, while still allowing space for genuine growth, that they required Tyler to do ongoing work rather than just apologizing and moving on. I left the meeting with a clear framework for the trust fund decision, feeling like I finally had a path forward that wasn't just about my anger or his apologies, but about actual change and maturity. Over the next few months, Robert showed up differently in our marriage. When Tyler called asking to come over unannounced, Robert checked with me first and told Tyler he needed to schedule visits in advance. When Tyler tried to minimize his past behavior during a phone call, Robert interrupted and said they weren't going to pretend 5 years of cruelty didn't happen. I watched Robert set boundaries without apologizing for them, without trying to soften the impact or manage everyone's feelings simultaneously. Our therapy sessions focused on communication patterns, and Robert admitted he'd been so afraid of conflict that he'd sacrificed my comfort to keep peace. He practiced saying hard things in session until they felt less scary, and then he started saying them at home too. One evening, Robert told me he finally understood that protecting me from Tyler's disrespect wasn't about choosing between us. It was about teaching Tyler how to be a decent person. Our relationship felt different now, like we were actually partners instead of him being a mediator between me and his son. The following week, I asked Tyler and Robert to meet me at our house for a formal conversation about the trust fund. Tyler arrived 15 minutes early and waited in his car until exactly the scheduled time, then knocked on the door instead of walking in like he used to. I had printed copies of the conditions Alyssa helped me draft, and I laid them on the kitchen table between the 3 of us. The document outlined specific requirements including 6 months of sustained respectful behavior, continued therapy with quarterly progress reports, and a written reflection on what he'd learned about assumptions and respect. Tyler picked up the papers and read through each page carefully, his finger tracing the lines as he processed the conditions. I explained that the money was always meant to support his future, but that required demonstrating the maturity and character to use it wisely. Robert sat quietly and let me lead the conversation, not jumping in to soften my words or advocate for his son. Tyler set down the papers and looked directly at me when he said he agreed to everything without trying to negotiate or minimize what he'd done. He thanked me for giving him a path forward instead of just punishing him, which showed he understood this was about growth rather than revenge. 2 weeks later, Christian pulled me into his office and told me the organizing committee for Tech Leaders Conference wanted me as a keynote speaker on cloud architecture innovation. The conference drew hundreds of senior professionals from across the industry, and a keynote slot was a significant professional recognition. I felt proud and excited in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years, not worried about downplaying my success to make anyone comfortable. That evening at dinner, I mentioned the conference invitation, and Tyler immediately asked if he could attend to watch my presentation. His request caught me off guard because it meant taking time off his new job and paying for conference registration. I studied his face for signs of performance or manipulation, but he just looked genuinely interested in seeing me present. I agreed he could come, curious whether his interest was real or just part of his apology campaign. The conference took place at a downtown hotel with multiple tracks and hundreds of attendees wearing badges and carrying program guides. I stood backstage reviewing my slides while the session room filled with senior directors, vice presidents, and chief technology officers from major companies. Tyler sat in the middle section taking notes on his phone like a student, watching me command a room of people whose expertise and influence far exceeded his current level. I talked about leading large-scale migrations, building high-performing teams, and driving innovation in technical architecture. The audience asked complex questions about implementation strategies and organizational change management, and I answered with the authority of someone who'd solved these problems dozens of times. Afterward, people crowded around wanting to discuss potential collaborations and exchange contact information. Tyler waited near the back of the room and didn't try to interrupt or insert himself into my professional conversations. When the networking finally cleared, he approached me and said he had no idea about the scope of my influence in the industry. He looked embarrassed when he admitted that he'd spent 5 years assuming I was nothing, while I was actually someone hundreds of professionals respected and sought advice from. Tyler showed me the notes he'd taken during my keynote, which included questions about technical concepts and observations about my leadership approach. He asked if I would be willing to mentor him occasionally as he navigated his early career, acknowledging that he'd dismissed years of potential guidance by treating me with contempt. The request felt significant because it meant regularly admitting he had something to learn from me. I agreed to monthly coffee meetings where he could ask for professional advice, establishing a new relationship based on mutual respect instead of his assumptions about my worth. 5 months after the graduation party, Tyler completed his therapy requirements and wrote a 10-page reflection on what he'd learned. The document arrived by email with a note saying he wanted me to read it before our next meeting. I opened the attachment and started reading his analysis of how assumptions and sexism had shaped his view of women's success. Tyler detailed specific moments when he'd chosen cruelty over curiosity, like the time he'd calculated the cost of my birthday gift and texted his father instead of considering why the gift made me happy. He wrote about his mother's bitterness after the divorce, and how her constant complaints about Robert's new girlfriend poisoned his ability to see me as a real person. The reflection was honest and uncomfortable, acknowledging that he'd been actively mean rather than just passively dismissive. I read through it twice, moved by his genuine reckoning with his own behavior and the patterns that had enabled it. That evening, Robert and I discussed the trust fund decision in our bedroom while Tyler waited downstairs. Robert told me he would support whatever I chose but hoped I'd consider partial reinstatement with ongoing conditions. I appreciated that he wasn't pressuring me toward forgiveness or using his own feelings to influence my decision. We agreed that Tyler had shown sustained change over 5 months through consistent actions rather than just words. The therapy completion and written reflection demonstrated real work on himself, not just surface-level behavioral changes designed to get access to money. Robert said he was proud of Tyler for doing the hard internal work, but he was more proud of me for maintaining boundaries that forced Tyler to actually grow. The next day, I met Tyler at the same coffee shop where we'd talked months earlier. He ordered my drink again and waited nervously while I organized my thoughts. I told him I was reinstating the trust fund with modified conditions. The full amount would vest at 27 instead of 25, with annual check-ins to ensure continued respectful behavior and personal growth. Tyler's eyes filled with tears, and he thanked me not just for the money, but for giving him the chance to prove he was different from the person who'd insulted me at his graduation party. He said he knew he didn't deserve my generosity after how he'd treated me, but he was grateful I hadn't given up on the possibility of relationship. Tyler asked if he could say something he'd been wanting to tell me, and I nodded. He said that learning who I actually am made him realize how much he'd missed by choosing contempt over connection. He talked about the mentorship conversations we'd been having and how much he'd learned in just a few months. Tyler said having me as a mentor and family member was worth more than any trust fund, which felt like the first time he'd valued me as a person, rather than a financial resource to resent. 6 months after the confrontation, our family dinners had become genuinely comfortable instead of performative. Tyler showed up on time, helped with cooking and cleanup, and participated in conversations like an actual member of the household. He asked about my work projects and Robert's golf games with equal interest, treating both of us like people whose lives mattered to him. One evening, Tyler brought his new girlfriend to meet us and introduced me by talking about my keynote speech and the cloud architecture team I led. The girlfriend seemed impressed and asked intelligent questions about my work, clearly having heard positive things about me before arriving. After dinner, she pulled Robert aside and mentioned that Tyler talked about me constantly at home, crediting me with teaching him about assumptions and respect. Robert told me later that hearing someone else recognize Tyler's growth made him emotional, because it meant the change was real enough for outsiders to notice. A few weeks later, I brought up something I'd been thinking about during one of our regular family dinners. I told Tyler I wanted to help with his student loan payments as a delayed graduation gift, not because he earned it through good behavior, but because I wanted him to start his career without that weight hanging over him. Tyler's face went pale and he immediately started shaking his head, saying he couldn't accept more money from me after everything he'd done. I cut him off and explained that being generous isn't about whether someone deserves help. It's about caring for family, and he'd finally stopped treating me like an enemy and started letting me be part of his actual family. Tyler's eyes filled with tears, and he thanked me quietly, his voice breaking a little when he said he didn't know how to make up for 5 years of cruelty. I told him he was already doing it by showing up consistently and treating me with real respect instead of fake politeness. That night after Tyler left, Robert pulled me aside in our bedroom and said he needed to tell me something. He sat on the edge of the bed and told me that watching Tyler's change over the past 6 months made him proud of both of us. Proud of Tyler for doing the hard internal work instead of just apologizing, and proud of me for keeping firm limits while still giving Tyler space to actually grow into a better person. Robert said our marriage felt stronger now than it had in years, because we'd finally dealt with the problems head-on, instead of pretending that patience and time would magically fix everything. I agreed and told him I felt genuinely hopeful about our family's future in a way I couldn't have imagined 6 months ago, when Tyler called me a leech in front of 70 people. 3 months later, we celebrated Tyler's 23rd birthday at a nice restaurant downtown, and halfway through dinner, Tyler stood up with his glass and asked if he could say something. He thanked Robert for being a great father who taught him about integrity, even when Tyler wasn't ready to listen. Then Tyler turned to me and said he wanted to thank me specifically for paying for his entire education, for supporting his career development with mentorship and advice, and for teaching him that respect gets earned through steady action over time, not demanded just because of family relationships. The other diners didn't need to hear our personal business, but I was glad Tyler chose to publicly acknowledge what he'd publicly denied for 5 years. Our family wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was finally built on honesty and mutual respect, instead of assumptions and resentment, which felt like the foundation we should have started with from the very beginning.